empire rise. Systems break. History leaves scars that never fully disappear.
At first glance, this still looks like a regional war. The fighting is centered in the Middle East. The missiles, drones, airstrikes, and retaliation are happening in and around Iran and its neighbors. On a map, it appears to be another dangerous conflict in a part of the world already known for instability. But that impression misses the real story. This war stopped being only a regional security crisis the moment it began disrupting the systems that global business depends on every day. That is why this conflict matters so much. A regional war becomes a global business shock when it hits trade routes, energy flows, air corridors, insurance markets, financing conditions, and corporate planning all at once. Runners reported that the U.S.-Israel war with Iran has already sent shockwaves through global business by disrupting major trade and energy routes, pushing oil prices higher, damaging data infrastructure, and forcing industrial producers to halt operation. This is not just a battlefield story, it is a system story. It is a story about how modern business really works, and how much of it still depends on fragile assumption. Companies assume ships can move, planes can fly, insurance can be secured, fuel can be purchased at manageable prices, and supply chains can keep operating under pressure. Once several of those assumptions break at the same time, the cost does not remain local. It spreads outward through logistics, margins, energy bills, investor behavior, and growth expectations. That process is already visible. Reuters reported that the Strait of Hormuz became nearly impassable during the conflict, while Brent crude climbed toward $90 per barrel and global companies began scrambling to manage rising costs and operational disruption. At the same time, key air corridors across the Gulf became unusable, creating one of the worst air traffic disruptions the region has seen since the pandemic. That is the hidden logic of this war. A regional conflict becomes a global business shock when it strikes not just territory, but circulation. It does not need to shut down the entire world economy. It only needs to hit enough of the arteries that keep trade, energy, transport, and confidence moving. Once that happens, the shock begins to travel on its own.
When oil stops moving, the shock does not stay in the desert. It travels through the whole world.
The first reason this war became a global business shock is energy. Modern business is more dependent on stable fuel flows than many executives like to admit. Energy is not just a commodity input. It shapes transportation costs, manufacturing margins, airline budgets, chemical production, logistics pricing, and inflation expectations. When a war threatens a route as important as the Strait of Hormuz, companies everywhere begin to pay attention, even if they have no direct exposure to the battlefield. Reuters reported that the conflict disrupted one of the world's most important oil and gas arteries, and not analysts at Barclays warned Brent could rise to $120 per barrel if tensions persist for a few more weeks. In a more severe scenario, Barclays said prices could move even higher. Reuters also reported that around 85 million barrels of oil were stranded on tankers in the Gulf as the disruption intensified. That matters because energy shocks do not stay inside energy markets. Once crude rises sharply, shipping becomes more expensive. Once shipping becomes more expensive, goods become more expensive. Once fuel costs rise, airlines face heavier operating pressure. Factories reassess production costs, and importers begin recalculating exposure. Energy-intensive industries are often hit first. Reuters reported that European manufacturers and industrial businesses were already under pressure from gas price spikes and production cutback, while metals and industrial material supply chains were also affected. And the shock is not limited to oil. Liquefied natural gas has also been hit. Reuters reported that global oil and gas prices jumped as the war halted energy export from the Middle East, with production stoppages from Qatar to Iraq. That matters especially for Asia and Europe, which remain heavily dependent on imported fuel and are therefore highly exposed to supply disruptions from the Gulf. This is the first business lesson of the conflict. A regional war becomes global the moment it starts for pricing fuel. Once that happens, the cost spreads through transport, manufacturing, aviation, and consumer prices. Companies do not need to be located in Iran or Israel to suffer from that chain reaction. They only need to operate in a world that still runs on energy.
What begins as a regional crisis never stays regional when energy, trade, and fear are tied to the same narrow corridor.
The second reason this war became a global business shock is transport. Globalization appears resilient from a distance because goods, cargo, and passengers are always moving. But that appearance depends on certain routes remaining open, predictable, and affordable. Once those routes become dangerous, this disruption spreads much faster than most people expect. That is what happened in both shipping and aviation. Reuters reported that maritime insurance premiums surged as the Iran conflict widened, with war risk rates jumping sharply as underwriters reassessed exposure in the Gulf. Insurance still existed, but it became much more expensive, which means trade did not have to stop completely for the damage to begin. The higher cost of risk itself became part of the shock. At the same time, air travel was thrown into chaos. Reuters reported that airlines across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East canceled or rerouted flights as Iranian and Iraqi airspace became unusable. Thousands of flights were disrupted, journeys became longer, fuel costs rose, and governments had to organize repatriation flights for stranded citizens. Reuters also reported that major hubs such as Doha and Dubai suffered severe disruption, while airlines warned that returning to normal operations would not happen quickly, even after some routes reopened. That matters because transport disruption affects far more than tourism. It affects cargo schedules, inventory timing, executive travel, aviation fuel use, aircraft positioning, and business continuity planning. Longer error rates increase operating costs. Delayed shipping raises uncertainty. Higher insurance costs heighten margins. Maersk even suspended to services linking the Middle East to Asia and Europe as the crisis deepened, which shows that the disruption is already reaching core supply chains, not just isolated operators. This revealed a brutal truth about modern business. Companies do not just depend on demand, they depend on movement. They depend on routes being safe enough to use, cheap enough to insure, and reliable enough to plan around. Once those conditions weaken, the shock begins to compound. Freight costs rise, delays grow, managers become more defensive. Investors begin asking which sectors are next. That is how a transport problem becomes a business shock.
A regional crisis becomes a global threat. The moment energy routes turn into battle lines.
The third reason this war became a global business shock is confidence. Markets and companies do not wait for the worst-case scenario to arrive before reacting. They move when visibility collapses. Once executives believe that energy routes may stay disrupted, that shipping may remain expensive, and that air traffic may stay unstable, they start changing behavior immediately. They reduce risk, delay deals, protect cash, postpone expansion, and prepare for weaker demand. Reuters captured that shift clearly. One Reuters report described investors clinging to so-called shockwaves orbit trades as the Iran war drove economic visibility close to zero. Another reported a rush by global firms and investors to adjust share sales and financing plans as the conflict erupted. That is not how markets behave when they see a short, containable event. It is how they behave when they fear a broader and more persistent economic shock. This is why the business impact of war is often larger than the physical damage alone would suggest. A missile can destroy an asset. Uncertainty can freeze a market. If companies stop trusting routes, delay capital decisions, or pull back on activity, the economic damage begins spreading even without total system failure. Reuters reported that the conflict has already affected industrial production, airline operations, data center infrastructure, and corporate planning. Economists warn that if the conflict drags on, it could shave billions from national output and potentially push some economies toward recession. And timing makes the shock words. This war is hitting a world already burdened by trade friction, fragile supply chains, inflation sensitivity, and years of geopolitical disruption. It is not striking a calm and confident global system. It is striking a tired one. Reuters reported that even the U.S economy, which is more buffered from energy shocks than before, now faces a fresh risk to resilience from the widening conflict. That is the hidden meaning of this story. A regional war became a global business shock because modern business is built on confidence in systems that are much more fragile than they appear. Energy routes must stay open, shipping must stay insurable, airspace must stay usable. Investors must believe visibility will return. When all of those assumptions come under pressure at once, the shock stops being local. History teaches the same lesson again and again. The most dangerous wars are not always the ones with the largest armies or the biggest headlines. They are the wars that strike the systems everyone depends on, but few people notice until they start failing. That is exactly what happened here.
We are not just following events. We are tracing the forces that move them.